Hey guys, welcome back. So today we are going to talk about competence and legal challenges. And if you couldn't pack two conversations, let me start the sentence again. These are two conversations that are so fraught with just like the capacity to freak you guys out so much. Like they're the worst to put together, especially if you're at a time when you're having a little bit of imposter syndrome or having second guesses about your skill set or something like that, and then throw it together like the threat of legal challenge, and it's just like the hard stuff. So I'm going to go through it, and I'm going to leave probably quite a few caveats as we go through all of this stuff. That first of all, ignore some of it for now and put it in a pocket and save it for later, because the legal stuff, you'll need to know how to navigate through some legal things, and there's a ton that you can pick up later. And I'm going to say that again. There's a ton that you can ask your supervisor about in terms of competence. There's so much, like, right now you're worried about your own competence, and as professors, my biggest concern is, are you building enough confidence in your own self, the confidence, as you're building your competence? Because so often we can be like, oh, I'm not sure what I'm doing, and I'm nervous and I'm scared. And then you lose track of yourself, lose sight of yourself, and you kind of stunt your own growth a little bit. And then later, that's what stuff we're going to talk about here, is later on when you're like, well, how do I justify my own competence to somebody else, or evaluate competence across the field? If there are situations where a person isn't living up to what they're supposed to be doing, how do I then look at the definitions of it and that kind of stuff? So it's such a scary topic, and yet you guys, probably most of you, are not at the place where we need to be having this conversation, but we can't wait till after you graduate to have it. So just to put that into context here as we get going forward. So first of all, it's really hard to define competence, and we spend not every meeting, but we oftentimes at our faculty meetings, we spend time thinking about, what do we really want to know that is completely essential to be able to do this kind of work about you guys? Like, what do we want to know about you guys? And I've had so many meetings in other programs and in other conferences, and there's like, this is just a big question. And there are different parts that go into what is competence, okay? But it's hard to define really what those are. So if we say, what skill set do you need? What are those skills? Like, what really defines what those skills are? And I could show you, if anybody's really curious, like the evaluations that we make, the assessments that go over all the skills required. You did them in principles, or you're doing them right now, maybe in principles. And that's not all of it. There's more. There's like, those are sort of like entry level skills, but then there are advanced skills. And some of those skills are dependent on your theoretical orientation. If you're an ACT therapist, you might have to have the skill of creativity and the use of metaphor. If you're a cognitive behavioral theorist, you have the skill of navigating through a person's schema and understanding the interconnected web of beliefs. If you are a DBT therapist, you have to have the skill of just knowing the DBT system. And like, there's just so many different kinds of things that could be categorized as skill. That's a little bit different than knowledge. So skills you perform. Knowledge is the stuff that goes on in your head. That's what comes out when you take standardized tests. That's what comes out when you write essays. That's different than your skills that you perform with another client. Okay, so school is really set up so that you can assess knowledge. But what we really want to know is more about the skill set that you have. You have a foundation of knowledge. You'll take your NCE test when you're done with the program, or a CRC test, or the NMHCE, the other one, whatever that is. I always get the acronym wrong. But you'll take those, and those will assess your knowledge. It's really the internship and the practicum that assess your skill. And then there's this other thing that ends up getting more people. It makes your program harder. It makes us have let me say this another way. The reason that people get in difficult situations while they're going through training is not because they're stupid, like they don't have the knowledge, not because they don't have the capacity for skills, because you probably do, but it's oftentimes a dispositional thing. Now, the reason that's tricky and challenging is because you can't evaluate a person based on personality. That's just discriminatory. But there is a certain sort of way of being or a presence or a warmth that sort of feels like a personality trait, kind of. But that's really the thing that makes a good counselor. So when it comes to competence, a person could be super smart and just completely relationally blind to, like, you know, miss social cues and not really be able to like connect with another person. So you could be really smart and you could do lots of great research in the field, but not be able to connect with clients. And that's okay, because we need all kinds of people doing all kinds of different things. But what's the base level of what you have to be in order to be just a base level counselor? So there's hopefully you can see, I'm not going to keep going with this because we could go on for a long time, but there's a lot packed into here and it's a little bit more complicated. So when you're looking around other people and you're like, that person's a counselor, for one, think about how limited your scope of understanding is of what a counselor is and should be, because that's one question. The other question is, against what metric? Is it just my internal interpretation of what I think is right? Because if we get in that territory, we're in some pretty scary situations where one person or a small group of people are determining what's good for a bunch of people, and we don't want that. So it's a better situation if I grade you in one class, somebody else grades you in another, and you have a site supervisor to provide oversight, and then there's all these different checks and balances in the system so that we can't single one person out. It also does create some challenges in terms of assessing competence. So I think I'm just going to leave that there, but there's a ton of stuff more to talk about. Actually, I'll mention these other bullet points and we'll continue to talk about it actually, but I don't want to get too carried away before we get further in here. So I'm going to pause myself a little bit, pump the brakes. So one of the things, skip down to this bottom one here first. I'm going to get my head out of the way for just a second. The law requires a minimum level to practice, but where that is can be difficult to define. Okay, so one of the things that most people don't like to hear this, but it's part of the reality of the situation we have, is that you don't, here at the school, we want you to be the best counselor you can be. Whatever kind of counselor that is that you plan on being, we want you to be the best. We want you to be effective. We know you're not going to be. We know you're not going to be as good as you will be in 5, 10, 15 years down the line. And somebody who's been practicing for 20 or 30 years should be even better, right? You should learn and grow over time. So we don't expect you to be like this phenomenal, great counselor. Most people come into the program saying, I want to be so good and I want to do it fast and I want it now. I don't want to wait for it. And we're like, well, okay, but that's kind of unreasonable, right? So let's start. Somebody just recently said, I need to learn to walk before I learn to run. And I was like, yes, that's so smart. Now, can you do that? Can you like set your expectations such that you are going to get the basic stuff first? So we want you to be good, but we know that there's limits to what that looks like. At the state level, the licensing board, they don't really care so much if you're effective. Whether you're a good counselor or not, that's not really the point. The point is, are you going to be safe? Are you dangerous? Are you going to hurt people? So they're more interested in what's the basic level of minimal competence that you need to have in order to not be a complete idiot. You know what I mean? Like, so there's different expectations at different levels. The law just says you can't be dangerous. You can suck at your job, but that's your right to suck. You just can't be dangerous, right? There's other checks and balances that we're not going to get into now in terms of like helping you be the best you can be. But that's what the licensing requirement is. Doesn't sound great, but it's really nice when you're out in practice and you can say, well, those other people aren't very good and I'm not going to refer to them, but they don't deserve to lose their license. You know what I mean? So that's an important part of this competence discussion here. And then going back up to the second main bullet point here, the spectrum of gross negligence on one end and maximum effectiveness on the other, that's where we want you to be, somewhere in there, right? Or I should say, that's where everybody is. We don't want you to be grossly negligent. You have to be better than that, but you don't have to be like the best therapist that ever lived who's going to like save the world just by emanating your aura around everybody. I'm sure a few of you are going to be like, yeah, that's me. I'm so good at this. Just kidding. I know you guys don't think that way, but so hopefully that frames a little bit of this before we get going. Oh, apparently I've said all my good points already. So we look at this as a developmental process. You'll graduate if you don't pose a risk to the field. Okay, so we're kind of like doing the licensing board's first level of defense. That way they can have confidence in us that if you graduate here, you're kind of ready for there. There is also that period between graduation and full licensing. That's why they have that, because we know that there's more work than you can do here. You're just kind of done gaining the knowledge, but there's still so much more practice learning that goes on out there that we, I don't know, kind of, this isn't the right way to say it, but like you farm out the responsibility to a site supervisor or your first boss or something like that. And we know it takes at least a good 4 to 5 years to get really good at this, but you don't need to be in school the whole time and paying tuition and all that kind of stuff. So that's why we have that. So we want to make sure you're not dangerous. We have to make sure that we believe that you meet the minimum qualifications. Again, you don't have to be excellent at it. You just have to be not dangerous. Okay. We also sometimes have high standards depending on our own expectations of you or of the field or all that kind of stuff. But you'll hear different faculty talk different ways about what you need to know, what skills are really important, and what competencies you really need to have that are more important, and that kind of stuff. But we have this third-party thing called accreditation right above my head here, or actually right over there. We have this third-party thing that says, here are the minimum standards to get into the field. Okay, so it's not just about my opinion or Jen's opinion or Ola or Amy or Mastawal or Gina. It's about the field has its own opinion. Again, another layer of check and balance to make sure that we're not being biased or discriminatory. So you will graduate if you don't pose a risk, if we believe you meet minimum qualifications, and you pass requirements based on accreditation standards. Okay, so those are like the three parts. One of the other, to the second bullet point here, one of the things we really look towards, if you're not going to be the best ever, we have to look at, do you have the potential to grow into whatever the best is? In other words, the best version of yourself. Are you on track to being somebody who's really going to be awesome? You're just new and you just haven't gained all those skills yet. So we look for potential. That's another thing. I kind of already mentioned this, but the trajectory or the potential for skill development, knowledge attainment, and core dispositions. Okay, so who are you going to be later on once you are on track? One of the things some of you have heard me say, but I haven't said this to everybody, is when you start in a program, you guys are often look to us to be super smart and to know all these things and to teach you all these things. And that's great, because who doesn't love to be looked at and respected and, just stroke my ego once in a while? That feels great, But an even better scenario is by the time that you're done, you're not looking to me for answers. You're knowing how to get those answers. Just like we've said in class, like, I don't want to teach you how to make all ethical decisions. I don't want to teach you the right answers. I want to teach you how to do that. It's sort of like, give a man a fish versus teach a man to fish, something like that. So I want you to be in the place where you know how to evaluate where to find answers and how to do certain things and be self-motivated to go explore and learn and grow even further, okay? That means commitment to personal growth. It means where to pick up more skills throughout that supervision process. And then what resources do you have to gain knowledge if you need it? That's kind of a better way of looking at your expectation when you get there, is you've come to a place where you don't need us anymore. What's that old phrase? When the student is ready, the teacher appears, and when the student is really ready, the teacher goes away. It's kind of in the spirit of this. Accreditation, kind of already mentioned it, but set quality standards for programs. They're set for sort of national best practice. So if you graduate from here, the licensing board in this state has confidence that you meet the standards in all other places or all other states. It's important because then if you go to move and you say, I went to a CACREP accredited program, they can say, well, CACREP accredits programs across the country. Licensing boards acknowledge that across the country, so you're probably good to go. It's an important level of establishing that we have competent professionals out there around the world, or around the country, not the world. And then I've already mentioned this last point, so we'll just skip over that one. So the question is, who protects? When I've talked about this like complicated web of different layers of checks and balances, we have the university, and we protect the field as gatekeepers, meaning the gates are closed and you guys are not counselors until we say, graduate, you go out and be fruitful or whatever. We don't say that, but you know what I mean? Like, go out and do your work. Until then, it's our responsibility to make sure you're learning and growing, but also we're making. I want to be careful of how I say this, because sometimes I say it kind of tongue in cheek, and I want to get better at that. But part of it is keeping the bad seeds out. If there's somebody out there who's just unhealthy and has an inability to really work with people and help people, then we want to make sure that doesn't happen. Okay. More often, in reality, the reason that people don't go through a program or don't complete a program more often has less to do with you're not good enough, or now is not the right time because personal life circumstances are keeping you away from being the best version of you. You know, people leave for medical reasons. People leave because family reasons. Doesn't mean that you aren't a helper. Doesn't mean you can't do this kind of work. It often means that situations outside of your control are affecting you. Sometimes they're inside of your control, and that just means there's time to figure it out. That's usually a better scenario if that's the case. So anyway, up until graduation, we're responsible, but we're guided by the accreditation process, which I've mentioned, by our own code of ethics, which we all are working on, and then by foundational research. We want to keep getting better, so we're doing a better and better job at knowing what we're trying to assess, or you know, what the standards of the field are and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of moving parts to this. I've already talked about accreditation, licensing. So the interestingly, the American Counseling Association, or the Association American School Counseling Association, ASCA, and various other professional associations, usually they're the ones to set the ethical code. So counselors around the country all come together and they give input into this document and say, here's the ethical code. And then the states pick that up, and through the licensing process, they apply it. So that's how it works. If there's an ethical problem, it goes to the states for licensing application. Now, there's one other caveat to that, is that if it's not an LPC or an LCSW or something like that, if it's not therapy, if we're talking about school counseling, this could be slightly different. I know in the rehab world, the states don't license rehab counselors, so it's the Commission on Rehabilitation Counselor Certification, CRCC. They're the ones that do the self-regulating. So if you have ethical issue with a rehab counselor, you reach out to that organization. If you have ethical issue with me as a therapist or as a licensed professional counselor in Wisconsin, then you reach out to the licensing board. Okay, so there's different levels of regulatory power involved here. I've already talked about state statutes and rules, this part right above my head, so I'm going to skip over that. The legal process is another part of this. So if there were no licensing board and there were no accreditation, there would be no way, let's say you were a student and you felt like you've been unfairly discriminated against in a program or dismissed for unfair reasons or whatever. You can now appeal to the accreditation board. You can appeal to, depending on where you're at in your career, like licensing boards. And we have all these checks and balances, not only to keep the bad people out, but to keep the good people in. Because sometimes it's us professors or licensing board members or politicians, like, you know, in the licensing process or something. Sometimes it's those people that are not doing a good job. And you need to have the power to be able to get through the system too. So this is all these layers and levels are complicated and messy, but they're here to protect everybody, not just the constituents of a state against you, but also protects you from all these other people who could be nasty to you, right? That's really, really important. If we didn't have those checks and balances, if we as a profession didn't agree that these are important elements to how we function, then all your recourse would be finding an attorney and then hoping you have a judge who is understanding of the issues well enough to make a good, solid decision about them. I don't know what else there is to say about that, except for that there are some places where there isn't a lot of oversight or self-regulation done by the field, so that it's really expensive and you need to bring people in and pay the money to do that. But also they don't understand who we are and how we are. So it's important that we self-regulate as a group. It gets tricky when we as a counseling profession are working basically alongside social workers as therapists, and both of us may look at this and say we're following two different standards, but we have the same similar licensing process. It gets a little bit messier since we're both doing the same job, but from different professions. So it's tricky, but anyway, hopefully this is making a little bit of sense in terms of who are all the people who have a stake in the game, so to speak. Okay, excuse me. A note about specialization. Okay, so our accreditation trains you to have core counseling skills. Excuse me. That is not just for the capacity to do the job of mental health counselor or therapist, because social workers can do that, marriage and family therapists can do that, psychologists can do that. But we want to train you to have the core counseling skills, and we want to train you to have this professional identity of what is counseling as it's unique to psychology, social work, all that kind of stuff. Accreditation helps refine that process, okay? So we are accredited as a mental health counseling program and a school counseling program. Within each program, when you guys were applying for this, you knew that different programs had different reputations and different faculty with different skill sets and different specializations. So you probably picked this for some unique reasons, some unique traits about us as a program. We sometimes can add that specialty. Like, for example, some of you may want to get an addiction license or a marriage and family therapy license. And those are things that are unique to this program. Not all programs do that, okay? So accreditation covers counseling, and then we add these other things based on what the licensing board requires to sort of to attract you guys to come to the program, so to speak. There are all kinds of ways in which you'll specialize after this too, depending on the clients you want to get and the trainings you want to receive and that kind of stuff too. But that comes from programs, certification bodies, training facilities, like all that kind of stuff. After you graduate, accreditation no longer applies to you. That's only something that applies to you as a student and us as an educational institution, okay? Unless you're working for an agency that has their own accreditation, which that's a whole different thing. But you are responsible for building that specialization, that the new training. It says up here, it's different than the medical field, although we may be going in that direction. What I was talking about there is how doctors specialize through the residency process. They do that while they're still kind of in training, a specialization. We just don't have that. Some people have suggested that we need to teach more about family systems, and students need to come out ready to do DBT skills and ready to have, be fully functioning as an ACT therapist or something. And with a 2-year degree and all of the other requirements that we have to cover while we're in the program, we just simply can't do that. And there's an argument to be made that we shouldn't do that. Imagine if you were like, well, I want to do a certain kind of work like sex therapy. And the program says, nope, you have to do I don't know, you have to do psychoanalysis. That's what we're doing. And you'd be like, but doesn't fit me. And so in some sense, you wouldn't really want a program to refine you into just a certain specific kind of counselor. So we leave it broad. We leave it sort of general and open on purpose, but it does come with a cost. Okay. So you get to choose the quality of your education because we don't require it of you. So choose the program you see fit. The way you market, the way you specialize yourself later, and the way you represent yourself and who you are, those often comes from, that's what determines your expertise and the word of mouth referrals. So there's no formal system to know how to refer, to know how to make referrals and to get referrals. It's really this sort of entrepreneurial space where you build a reputation by doing the best work you can and by staying connected to people in your community. That's how this works. That's how you both build your specialization and maintain a workload at the same time. Okay. So there are some agencies, like I work at a place right now where outside of the school, where the person who makes appointments, they just fill my schedule. They don't care about my specialties per se. I mean, I tell them like who I can see and don't want to see and stuff. But referrals are made pretty simply through that system, and other people can refer really easily by just making an appointment. But it doesn't work that way across cities, and we're not integrated into medical systems and that kind of stuff, where referrals are just sort of passed on from one provider to the other. So it requires a little bit more work on our part, so to speak. This second point, I'm gonna get myself out of the way while I read this. Not second point, the second to last. All of this stuff, sometimes we look at this and we're like, oh, that's a problem. We should provide more guidance and more support through the process. And yet, it's a privilege to have this level of independence, even though it's more work and it's sometimes harder and scarier to navigate it. It's a privilege. It's a privilege to practice in any state. You don't have the right to be a counselor. You don't have the right to be a provider. And that's why we need to kind of maintain some sense of vigilance of like, I need to be good. I need to continue to do good work, because if I don't do good work, I shouldn't be helping in the ways that I think I can. I'm impaired, right? And there's also a process to take that away if people are still continuing to practice, but they are impaired, okay? That's really helpful to know for you. If you're out in the field and people are doing things that are inappropriate, there needs to be a sense of recourse for how we can make sure that they're not continuing to practice if they're hurting people, right? But that puts a little bit more of the responsibility on you. So the last part that I'll say about this is that this last point down here is it also means that a lack of competence, or like I didn't know, is not a defense if problems arise. Okay. And this is one of those like scary phrases where I don't want you to leave this feeling like I have to know everything, because there's a sense of pressure that comes along with that when you hear stuff like this. But even if you don't know everything, there's still more classes to take. There's supervision to work through, and there are training resources, and there's all kinds of stuff that you're still supposed to that you have the opportunity to learn. Even though it's expected of you to know it, you don't have to know all of it now. Remember, it's our job to assess if you have a base level of minimal competence. If we do that, the field says, okay, you're good to go. Even if you don't feel like that. If you feel like, oh, I need to know more, I have to know everything. And we're like, no, but you're good to go start. That's worth something, okay? So you get to decide if you're anxious and you're like, oh, I can't do this, I got to know more things. Or if you're like, I really have no freaking clue, I'm just going to trust these guys, in which case you might want to, get a little bit more confident about where you're at in the process. Okay, but let's keep going. I feel like I'm leaving some of these threads frayed at the end, meaning I'm not explaining the conclusion or what point I'm specifically making, because there's all these different moving parts to it. So I'm going to do my best to wrap this up and bring it all together at different times, but that one I left a little bit open. So let's talk about burnout a little bit. It's a word that you guys have all heard a million times. We know, yep, self-care, all that kind of stuff. I think we've probably talked about these things enough. Like this is professionally a one-way caring relationship. In other words, I don't know where this phrase came from, if that was from the book or if I put that one on there when I was putting this together or what, but essentially you're loaning your time, your relational capacity, you're loaning parts of you so that people can, and this is my terminology, so that people can build attachment that they missed out on, and then build new skills that are required or that to help through life in the case of healthy attachments, okay? But those attachments are temporary, and those attachments are alone, they're not permanent, and in some sense they're artificial, meaning it's not a two-way relationship where we are supportive of each other and will always be there. This is a professional thing. It requires money and certain unique boundaries, okay? But the idea is to mimic that attachment that happens in social relationships in real life, okay? If you can't do that, if you can't provide that kind of attachment, that relational capacity, that's when you're running out of the potential to be helpful, okay? Now, this comes, imagine this on a scale. Get away from the spectrum for a sec. You fill up this, we'll use cup. I'm imagining one of those like scientific cylinders that high school teachers and college professors show in front of stadium classrooms or whatever. But anyway, you have this capacity to be helpful, and at different times in life, sometimes it's really full because you're like, I just got a promotion, and my clients are all doing well, and my kid just graduated from, I don't know, or it's got like an award for their sporting event or something, and life just seems to be up, and you're like, I'm so good at this, I can help people, I'm doing great. And there's other times a parent passes away, your dog dies, you're having conflict with your spouse. There's all kinds of things that can sort of take down your cylinder of capacity to be available for other people. In other words, if I don't take care of myself and I'm going through too much, there's a point at which I just am not available for people. Now, there's some point where you're just going to be reduced in effectiveness, and you just won't probably be as attentive and maybe not do as good of a job. And I don't know what that point is exactly. There's lots of different unique ways to talk about it, but at some point, you're going to do more harm than good. Okay, so the point to take away in this slide is that there's an erosion of that competence over time, depending on circumstances of life. Whether you're there or not, that's where you can get some help from other trusted people to be like, you need to take a step back, right? Or, no, you're fine, but this is hard. And I've had this conversation so many times throughout the years, and even with some of you right now, of like, I feel like there's a lot going on in life, and I don't know if I'm too broken to be able to do this kind of work, or too unhealthy or whatever. And that's a really worthy conversation to have, because sometimes maybe you are, and other times, no, you can compartmentalize things and keep your pain home, and bring your relational capacity to work and use that there. One thing I'll say about that, and then I'll leave this alone, is that if you're using your work to fulfill, if you're giving away all of your relational capacity at work, but not giving it at home, there is something backwards about that, and that it's a kind of a red flag, something to note. Because if you have lots of conflict at home, but then you come to work and use all this relational stuff to help people do really good, I bet you'll find over time that you're going to run into some issues. I've had this at various times in my life too, professionally, where I've been like, it's just, I feel like an imposter or a fraud or a hypocrite or something like that, because like my home life is so messy, but I'm doing fine at work. And anyway, it's worth noting that kind of stuff, but it doesn't mean that you can't do the work or you're bad at it or something like that. So what are some of those risk factors? Prior addictions is a risk factor. If you're clean and sober, it doesn't mean that you can't have prior addictions, but it does mean that you're at risk for if stress mounts and you eventually relapse, because a lot of addicts will talk about relapse is inevitable. It's not just like, if it happens, but when. So it's not something you have to, it completely like makes really struggling here. I've been talking, I did another recording before this, and I had a meeting before that, so pull it together. It doesn't mean that you are not qualified to do this work if you have prior addictions. And ironically, the more you're open and out with them, the better off you'll likely be at managing them, as long as you're not getting annoying to people because they're like, yeah, we've heard your story. Let's talk about other things that are more relevant to us. So vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma, or regular old trauma, whatever that is. Regular old trauma is the stuff you bring in from your life. Vicarious trauma is the stuff you acquire from other people that you hear about. So if people are telling you all about the child abuse that they experience, and you go home and you start to lose a little bit of faith in humanity and start to like be more protective of your children and like that kind of stuff, if it's bleeding over into your life, that's vicarious trauma. There's also predisposed characteristics, whether those are from trauma or not, it's a whole discussion. But here's just a list of some of them: perfectionism, imposter syndrome, parentification, or taking responsibility for others willingly, audience sensitivity. So like some of us are here because we call ourselves empaths. I don't know where that word came from, but it started getting used like 5 years ago or something. Like, I still think it's kind of funny, but an empath is like the typology of person who feels for other people. All of us have the capacity for empathy, and all of us have the capacity for feeling. And many of us are strongly sensitive to it. But even people who look like they don't have a care or concern for other people are often sometimes the most easily triggered people, because they spend so much time looking for the problems in the world and getting so defensive about them because they need to get set off. And they're so defensive about their own way of life or something like that. So that strong sensitivity, whether it's empathic or looks angry and uncaring, are both risk factors for burning out in this field. What these look like, what burnout looks like, is frustration, confusion, anger, sadness, exhaustion, projection, or other people are responsible for my condition, like you're blaming people or something like that. If you're jaded, everybody's had a job probably where you've got in and they're like, oh, well, once you're around for long enough, honey, you'll understand how stupid it is, or how the boss is just that way, or whatever. A cold presence. In other words, I can't loan more of myself out to support people. Inflexibility or rigidity is another way to say that. Protectiveness of self in practice, lack of client concern, workaholism, and just like there's a million other different things that this could look like. So if you see some of you in this list, know that I do too, and lots of people do, and it doesn't mean you can't do the work again. It's just these are the things to look out for. I'll tell you one quick example from my life just to show you what this can look like, how sneaky it can be. Some of you in this class might think, oh, Aaron seems like he's got it all together. He's got some, he's kind of a put together guy, whatever. And others of you are like, no, what a clown. This guy's just a joke, Regardless of that, I try to do my best to be fully authentic and honest and open about things that are relevant to you. I'm not going to just sit here and tell you all my life stories, because who cares? Like, you guys don't care about them. And even if you do, let's talk about it later or something. Some people can handle hearing stories and still maintain the relationship. Other people would be like, well, why am I learning from this guy? I need to run away from that because he's nuts. I don't know if full competence is the goal or authenticity is the goal, but I'll tell you mine is first and foremost going to be more authenticity while I work towards being more competent. But one of the things that so right behind my head here, workaholism. I won't get into too much detail, but if we've ever talked about kind of personalities, I'm a 7 on the Enneagram. And the Enneagram, number 7 is what's usually called the enthusiast or something like that, which means I'm an extrovert. I love new experiences, and I hate missing out on experiences. So like, it's like a chronic case of FOMO. Like, I just want to see so many things and do so many things, and I want to learn all the things. And so throughout my life, it's led me to be very accomplished because I've learned how to, I've made it through as many levels of school as I can. And I've built log cabins, and I know how to knit, and I can play guitar, and I can do, and I can code computers, and like, I can do all kinds of fun things. And if I'm unhealthy and I'm not careful, I can get too overly focused on task lists and things I have to do and making sure I'm achieving something. And if not, I run over people in the process of it. I don't really do that, but like sometimes I forget my family if I get too involved with work. And so there have been times in my life where I've said, I need to lean into work because, get my finger right, I need to lean into work because I'm dealing with stress in my own personal life. And so if I see myself getting too overly focused on work in a way that takes away from relationship with both myself and the people I love, then I know something is off. And I know this burnout kind of thing is happening, right? I'm sure all of you have your own stories of perfectionism and sort of this like cold paranoia, this lack of trust of other people and that kind of stuff. Doesn't mean you're bad, but it does mean there's something going on that puts you at risk, right? I have it. You have it. We all have risk factors. Doesn't mean that we're not competent, okay? The more we deal with them outwardly with people, the better off we're going to be. Okay, so enough said about that. So let's talk about assessment. We actually are going to talk more about this in the assessment class, but I'll cover it here too. Just checking the time. How many slides we got? Oh, we got some pictures coming up. I gave away my secrets. So we're talking about psychological evaluation. Okay, so like our appraisals class where we're doing assessments. There's a long history of, I don't know, discord or argument or, I don't know, debate. Maybe that's the best way for it to say it. I don't know. But psychologists were the first professionals after psychiatrists. So psychologists sort of made the historical break from psychiatrists because they're trained as medical doctors, but we do something else. We train specifically in the mind and the psyche and that kind of stuff. And then counselors broke off of that. And counselors said, well, we're only trained to a master's level and you guys are doctorates, but we can still we know how to do these assessments. Some of them are not that complicated. And psychologists said, well, some of them are that complicated, so we need to have some guardrails legally that say which ones you can and can't do. And so this thing right up here about like level A, B, and C tests, you'll talk more about that in the appraisals class, but like level A is sort of like anyone can do them pretty much. Level B is, these are rules of thumb, but there's other parts to this too, but like you have to have a master's degree to do level B tests, and C are typically reserved for people who have doctorate degrees. Unless you get further training and good supervision and you can ethically say you're competent in that test administration method or something. But that's generally how that goes. So in Wisconsin, here's a link. I'm not going to click on it. Well, I'm going to click on it and see what happens. Probably going to do nothing on the screen behind me, but oh yeah, I'll pull it over here in a sec. Just give me a sec. So if you click on this link, it pulls up the Wisconsin State Legislature, and there are specific requirements specific for the use of assessments. And I'm not going to go into this, but psychometric testing and psychotherapy rules. It's this testing one. In fact, let's see if I can get to it. Here it is. I'm not going to read it. You guys can see. Let me go to my screen. Yeah, you can look at you either have the link or you can read what's above me, but just know there are some laws specific to the requirements. Let me say this again. There are some laws about psychometric testing. Now, the thing to know, the thing to take away from this, I'm going to get back to our slides here. The thing to take away from this is some people look at that and they say, well, I can't perform psychometric testing because it's not legal. Others will look at it and say, no, you can do whatever you want. And it's a very vague and broad definition. The definitions of what you can and can't do have a lot to do with ethical use of tests and whether you've been trained enough and what you have competence to perform, okay? So with that said, going back to the first slide, there's some stuff we do here in school, some things you get trained on in your supervision process, and other things you're going to learn independently on your own way, depending on where you work and what your interests are, okay? So when it comes to the laws, what we really want to make sure is that people are practicing ethically and they're competently trained to do things that aren't going to hurt people, okay? So you're going to come out of this school probably saying, well, I don't really feel confident in any particular use of some like certain tests. There are some that you'll feel pretty good about, I think, but others are going to be like, we talked about it, but we didn't use them or practice them enough for me to feel really competent. And that's okay. It's an opportunity for you to get more training. You should have the basic skill set to be able to learn A level and B level tests. That's the goal here. It's not to get you really good at all of the tests, right? Because there's too much. But you will have enough training in statistics and psychometric analysis in administering and scoring tests and like those kind of things that you'll be able to do level B tests. Excuse me. Some of you will even probably have some experience now and could potentially go on to get more experience in level C tests. One last thing here that I'll say about that. I took some extra classes in personality testing when I was in doc school from the psychology program. And so now I feel like I'm trained to do some of those personality tests, but there's still some that I'm like, I don't use them enough to be really competent in. I don't feel like I would confidently pick up that test and do good with it. It's just like if I picked up an assault rifle, I'd be like, I don't know what to touch and what not to touch. So I'm going to be very reluctant with it. And I think it's probably best if I just don't. You know what I mean? So, although I have shot an AR-15 and it was awesome. I loved it. But I don't touch them without help from people. I had a friend whose dad his dad was an NRA rifle instructor, and he had a gun that he built with his brother, and so he let me shoot it, and I'm like, with you around, I feel safe, and I think everybody else here is safe. By myself, not so much. Okay, so that's the same philosophy applies with all this stuff. I think the rest of this looks, well, I got a couple of things I want to say. So first of all, evaluation, whether you're making a diagnosis, whether you're assessing for parental capacity, like some of you might do evaluations on whether kids to help settle custody disputes, that kind of thing. Employability testing is another one that oftentimes there's a lot lower of a risk because the consequences are a little bit lower with employability testing. But that's not always the case. I've done employability testing where the outcomes of my analysis could mean a person who was injured at work could either potentially receive or not receive a big settlement or payout that could help fund their future medical care. And so sometimes there are high stakes situations, but depending on those circumstances, you may be okay to do it if it's a low risk situation, or if you say it's a really high risk situation, maybe I shouldn't, right? Okay, because it's like, let's say you take that AR-15 out to the gun range where it's I don't know when people go to the gun range, but let's say it's like a Wednesday afternoon and everybody's at work and there's no one there, then it's probably a little bit lower risk. But if it's a super busy day and there's a lot going on, maybe you don't do it at that time, right? That's such a stupid example. I don't know why I brought that one up. But you know what I mean. Maybe driving is a better one. If you're out practicing driving on a Sunday afternoon when there's lots of people on the road versus like a Tuesday night, different scenario, right? So context dependent. I'm going to skip over this second one, but the last one I will talk about. There's a difference between formal testing, the tools that you use, and the informal testing, or the decisions you make based on clinical interview, and learning and recognizing a person's dysfunction or their pain or their symptomology or something like that. So what we're really talking about here is the use of formal tools, most often psychometric tests, not the ability to do an adequate clinical interview. However, the reason that we can't hold people accountable on doing a bad job in their clinical interviews is because you just don't see it. There's not as many consequences of it. So we'll just leave that part there as it is. Okay. I was told recently that I should not put GIFs in my presentations. So I'm going to describe what you're seeing on the screen in case there's anybody who can't see it. But on the left-hand side, there is a, what would this be called? Like a half cab nollie kickflip. I used to skateboard when I was a kid. So like that, I know the name of that. Some of you are going to look at that and you're going to be like, I don't know what all that flipping and twisting and spinning is, but I can see he's going down that pipe thing, right? You don't know what that is because you're inexperienced and you're not part of that nuanced world. For those of you that know basketball, this one above my head here, I don't know the first thing about basketball. I know that's a dunk, but I don't know why that's cool. I can't understand the nuances of style. I don't get impressed by it. I just don't know how hard that is to do this, the basketball thing, right? I think it's called a windmill, maybe, but I just don't know. The reason I'm bringing this up is that when it comes to competence, especially that informal kind of competence of like being able to see things in people's behavior and thought patterns and that kind of stuff, we're talking about the difference between recognizing and naming the differences of why one trick is cooler than the other trick, or why one, being able to even just talk about it and have a conversation about it and be a part of that community, okay? So when we're thinking about competence, I'm going to skip forward here because I can't. Actually, I'm going to skip back because it hurts my brain to sit there and watch it on loop. But when we're thinking about competence, on one hand, it's what you learned in school, and it's the trainings you've been to and the tests that you've passed, and you can sort of hold that badge of honor that says, yep, I made it through this counseling program and I passed that test and all that kind of stuff. And that means something and it stands for something. On another hand, there's something to be said for, I went through the school of hard knocks and I now can have a conversation about the dunk versus the flip trick, skateboarding trick. Both of them are helpful. Some of them you're going to have more than others, and there's two different kinds of competence there, right? So how you have that discussion later kind of matters in terms of what you're capable of. So I don't know that there's a whole lot more I want to say about it, but you'll have people in this room or, in this class who will say, well, once I get through school, I'm capable of doing those things. And other people that say, no, until you know what that dunk looks like and how to talk about it, until you can really appreciate it fully, you can't use those tools and you can't practice. My opinion is that if you have to learn somehow, and there are certain calculated risks that you take, one of the first things you'll do is find somebody to help you. Find some training, find a supervisor, find somebody who can teach you these things, right? Because it helps to have a guide and it's another person to keep you safe. The second part is it's okay to engage in the use of things if you've been trained, you've had supervision, those are the ethical requirements. And even if you're a little scared to start using it, there's still something to be said for, I'm going to take a risk and try this out just for the sake of learning, okay? So take that for what it's worth. And I guess I could have showed you these things. Is there a risk if you get it wrong? And if the client takes out that risk, bad situation. If you're taking on a little bit more risk yourself, or that can be okay. One of the things I did, for example, I was learning about some intelligence testing, and I said, before I use this on any kind of client, I'm going to do it on a few of my friends and others just for the sake of practice, just to make sure I can administer it adequately and understand the interpretation of results and kind of talk through it a little bit. So I got some training, essentially. Okay, and last, we got a whole bunch. I might pause to take some water. Maybe I should fly through this. Okay, let's look at this. A note about diagnosis. Counselors don't generally like diagnoses. We see them sometimes as, although I don't think this is quite as true here, but I've seen this in other places. See it as kind of a necessary evil. It's just for reimbursement, but you don't really have to take it seriously because as long as you get paid, who cares? There's lots of different controversial opinions about it. We'll talk more about it in other classes, so I'm not going to give it a ton of time here. But there's all kinds of problems, places this can go wrong. You can diagnose somebody inappropriately and give them, they have to live that down, or, maybe they're being treated inappropriately. It'd be like saying, oh, you just experienced a stroke, as opposed to you have anxiety, because they're going to give you a lot different medication for a stroke, right? And that could have potential consequences. So you can diagnose somebody wrong. You can also underdiagnose somebody and just give them what a lot of people do is just say everybody has an adjustment disorder, in which case that sometimes people don't get the care they need if they're not elevated to the certain level of care that they require, right? I'm going to say, we talk about some of these things in other classes too, but I'm going to save a lot of that for later just for the sake of time. Okay, now we're going to talk about some more of the legal parts. Okay, so let's talk about the definition of malpractice. After having had the conversation that we just had about the other chapter, malpractice is sort of where that level of dangerousness, like you're actually doing something wrong that are going to hurt people. That's what we're talking about here. So professional misconduct or lack of skill, failure to render professional services to the level expected in a particular community or by a prudent member of the profession. Okay, now think about what I told you earlier about the difference between being just ineffective and hurtful and harmful and dangerous, okay? This definition of malpractice is a little bit different, all right? And that's really important to understand some of the differences. The difference here is that there's a certain level of normal. And that certain level of normal means that if you're below that normal, you could be practicing inappropriately, something like that. The reason that's important is you can't just say you made mistakes, because everybody makes mistakes, right? You're making dangerous mistakes, but it's sort of like what are the norms and values and the ways people behave normally? And that can look a lot different depending on who you're looking at and where your community is and that kind of stuff. So it puts counselors in a really strange position of like trying to fit some status quo template. And it's a really precarious legal situation to be in because this definition is pretty vague, if you ask me. I mean, it's really helpful and important because it then says like this person is doing things that nobody else does, and it's kind of risky. I think used to be hypnosis got all the flack about this. Now there's hypnosis is coming back a little bit, but practicing like ketamine assisted therapy has a pretty strong research foundation now. Psychedelic assisted therapy is getting there, but it's still kind of like on the fringes of what's acceptable, probably because it's illegal still. But do you see what I mean? Like if you start practicing with some new innovative technique that's based on very risky kinds of work, that can be a real problem. If you're just trying a new technique that's very similar to other sort of, I don't know, vetted techniques, it's not the right word, but like things that are approved of by the field generally, versus I'm going to take a bunch of people into the woods and do a retreat where even if we're not using drugs, but we're going to experiment with this new social orientation style kind of thing, even that gets to be on the edges of what's acceptable and what isn't. Okay. A lot of controversy to be had here, but that was a big thing back in the 60s and 70s when people were doing these like weekend retreats, and some people were doing like social experiments out in the woods to try and build like this ideal society and that kind of stuff. And it got people got hurt and lawsuits happened, and so the practice adjusted. So I'll leave it at that. But then there's a definition we've talked about before, but a scope of practice, what's within the bounds of counseling, what's acceptable in the bounds, and what's not, what's outside of the scope of practice, what you can't do, how you can't treat people, what you talk about, that kind of stuff. I'm just going to check to see how many slides we have to make sure. Oh man, we got a lot of them. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'll just keep going. You guys, if you need to, just pause it at about the hour mark here, and then, yeah, we'll just do that. So, suicide. If you recall from a past class, we talked about the Tarasoff decision, which was I think it was from California, but the Tarasoff decision required us to warn people if there's significant and imminent risk of harm to self or others or vulnerable adults, that kind of thing. That's at least started that conversation. These are some of the most stressful situations that you'll come across because, and in fact, most of you will run into them in practicum where you're like, okay, I don't want to get it wrong. And I want to make sure, if you see something, say something, right? So like, I want to be hyper vigilant and make sure that I call out everything and get help if I need it and warn people and all that kind of stuff. But that comes at a cost of risking the potential well-being of that client and at least their trust in you and that kind of stuff. It can. So you don't want to be too quick at the trigger, but you also don't want to be too loose with it, because if something happens and you don't warn somebody, that's a problem too. So it sort of leads to these really stressful situations. It's impossible to fully predict suicidality or homicidality. You just can't do it. The whole point here is to be better at predicting it and to being trained enough to be trained enough to at least be able to spot red flags and concerns and act on them if you need to. Okay. So the book, I think, does a really good job of saying how big of an issue this is, how much responsibility rides on us, and also how we are human and you just can't know everything. And it's not on you if somebody on your caseload or one of your clients does pass away. It's not your fault. And yet there's something that we're supposed to provide. The question is, what is that? That's a hard thing to discuss and talk about. It's rare for for counselors to be held liable for client suicide. But, and I leave that big but up here because it can happen and you want to be vigilant, but also you can't lose your mind thinking about how responsible you are as opposed to other people's decisions. Okay. you will learn how to use the Columbia. We'll talk about it. We talk about it in this class. I'm sure you're talking about it in other classes. You take classes on crisis and you'll talk about it there. You'll see people in practicum and get field experiences around the topic. You'll have lots of training about it. And make sure that you get to a point sometime in your career, ideally sooner than later, where you feel comfortable and confident dealing with this and working through the issues. Now, it's one thing to be able to provide community resources and know that community. That takes time to learn when you get to a new place, but at least get down the capacity to have the conversations, to do the assessment, to understand what to look for and that kind of stuff. So if schools don't cover it, which we don't cover it enough, we could do so much more on it, but just get yourself to a good place there. Page 190, check out the action plan. There's some resources there from Unibooks, so I'm not going to spend time on that one. Okay, documentation. Here, again, the legal standard of documentation. We talked last week about all the different kinds of progress notes, clinical case notes, regular case notes, psychometric notes. Like there's all kinds of words that we use for documentation. So I'm not going to tell you everything you need to know, but recall that conversation, and then here's a few other things. Things to include in your notes if working with suicidal clients. What precipitated your concern about the client? Referral by another or something the client said or did. So did you note this in an assessment? Did somebody, another provider tell you about this? Was it something that happened in session? Write that down. That's helpful to know. Was it questions you asked the client and his or her responses indicated something, even if it wasn't something specifically that they said? Examples of this are like, I gave away my 401k this afternoon because, I just thought other people could benefit from having it. And I also dropped off some things at Goodwill. Those are kind of signs that, hey, maybe there's something else going on here. People kind of giving away their possessions and that kind of stuff. Some other things to write down here. I'll just get myself out of the way like this. People you consult with regarding the situation, write that down. Interactions you had with other persons regarding the situation. So documenting all of these things can really help keep you safe. Document within reason and with good intent. I mean, you don't want to spend your whole time writing things down, but if you're not in the practice of writing stuff down that could keep you safe later on, this is a great place to start doing it, because when you think about the situations that you could get into legally as we go through this class, those are the situations when you maybe want to have a better process in mind or in practice, I should say. There are some situations, even with you guys as students, some conversations I have that I'm like, yeah, I don't need to write that one down. Others I'm like, I should probably keep this email and stash it away somewhere, because this person's could potentially be in a rough situation soon that we have to use this. And I don't like thinking about that. I don't even like talking about it. It feels dirty, like I'm keeping secrets somewhere. And it's not really that, but sometimes there are situations in which you need to be able to protect yourself or other clients or your practice or something like that. So I don't have a space in my desk, by the way, where I'm keeping notes about you guys. We have notes on file and that kind of thing, but they're not like, this person is scary and this person's dangerous. Not like that. But you're assessing risk, right? And documenting when you need to. Okay. I'm going to skip this slide just for the sake of time. These are things that you can do. In fact, you guys can look at these if you want to, but these are things you can do to mitigate risk. So you don't have to get in these weird situations where you're spending all your time documenting and, handling crisis kind of stuff. But if you're practicing well, you're dealing with intense emotions, you're confronting and discarding negative patterns, all that kind of stuff. If you're doing those things, it makes your job a whole lot easier on the back end. Risking harm of others. So we're out of the territory of suicidality now. We're talking about homicidality. Similar responsibilities. We have a duty to foresee serious and imminent risk to the safety of others. Recognizing imminent risk is, again, we talked about that, the spectrum of tolerance of anxiety. Those of us that are like, oh my gosh, the world is a scary place and everybody's dangerous, we have less tolerance for anxiety, and we kind of just like, whoa, we need to warn somebody, tell somebody, say something. And those of us who are just way too lackadaisical about it and be like, nah, I mean, they'll be fine, right? We don't want to be in those kind of places. So we have the responsibility to notify people what that responsibility is, and when you use it is where you get practice. I have a note up here about Texas. Texas has a specific law that counselors have more of an allegiance to their therapeutic relationship than they do to other people. In other words, they're putting because you can, please forgive me if I get this wrong about Texas, but I think the rationale is kind of the responsibilities on individuals to protect themselves, not counselors to protect them. So it has more to do with like some dangerous person comes to your house, you protect yourself. How we need to do that. And so there's different gun laws and property rights and all that kind of stuff. Whereas other places would say, no, people can't legally be required to know how to keep themselves safe from dangerous people because they just show up unannounced oftentimes. So it's the therapist's job who's in the best position to do that, protecting. And regardless of what you think about any of that stuff, we do have some responsibility there. I've already mentioned this other part about the risk to the therapeutic relationship, so I will skip over that part too. As far as reporting on ethical misconduct, it's not unusual to be threatened with ethics complaints, and that can be true in some places and maybe not so true of others. I'm pretty sure the book didn't say that, but I said that one. Those are my words. If you're working with highly volatile clients or high-risk clients, or if you're working within a court system or prison system or some kind of correctional facility, you're going to get a lot more of this, like, well, you'll be hearing from my lawyer. Just threats like that, kind of power moves. I don't think it's all that common. And like, if you're treating depression and anxiety with adults, a lot less common. If you're treating depression and anxiety with children, with parents who can get angry if you're not helping their kids in the way they want to, it can get more common. But still, it's not that often that these kind of things happen. If you find yourself as the kind of person who does push boundaries or tries innovative techniques or risky things, you're probably more likely to get in situations like this. If you aren't challenging, the question is, are you effective? Are your boundaries clear? And if they are, you're probably in good territory, and it's not going to be that common that you're going to get in some kind of issue. Also, if you are the person that just tries to stay out of the limelight and maybe not taking enough risk, but also just not being really effective because you're just sort of avoiding challenge or problem or conflict, that could be a problem too, but they tend to get into less hot water. You know what I mean? So it kind of goes both ways. On one hand, you could be not as effective and just not trying hard enough and sort of staying out of problem or conflict, just conflict avoidant. On the other hand, you might be pushing boundaries too much and need to back off a little bit. So it kind of goes both ways. I think this term justice obsession syndrome. Think about the person who, I think it comes from the book, by the way, but I'm thinking about the person who just holds grudges and just can't let things go. Sometimes people just they just can't stop and evaluate and say, oh, there's another way to handle this conflict. So anyway, I don't know. I'm just going to leave that term there because I'm blanking a little bit exactly what I want to say about it. But another sort of good thing to mention is try to work directly with the client first to de-escalate the situation. If you guys have an issue with me and the first thing I do is go complain to one of my colleagues here, one of the other professors, and start building a file on you and logging it away in my desk about just to protect myself, I'm doing it wrong. Right? The first thing I need to do is first check in with myself and say, am I ready to have this conversation? And then go talk to you guys about it or my clients about it and say, hey, I'm ready to de-escalate this. Are you wanting to do that? Because I want to resolve this. And that's part of our skill set that we should be developing and growing, is the ability to de-escalate conflict situations, right? We try to do this with couples and with individuals and hopefully within our own lives too, with our clients. That's part of our responsibility. On page 203, there's more about how licensing boards work. So if you want to talk, if you ever need to like make a complaint or something, the one thing to note is that they can't be anonymous. You can't just make anonymous complaints about other therapists, because if you're doing that, you're not doing it right. You should have the integrity to first of all talk to somebody. It's our ethical responsibility to address things in person with the person who's the problem, even if you don't know them. Sometimes it can be helpful. There's some confidentiality things too, but if you learn about something that you know is happening, you have the responsibility before you go reporting it to somebody else to go deal with it. These aren't the days of where you go tell the teacher and tattletale on Susie because she did something stupid. This is the time where you get to deal with these. So one of the things I hope that you guys take away from this is that our challenge in school here is I'm trying my best to live up to this standard myself and to help you guys get there, where we have the integrity to just handle stuff independently and go ask for people for help if you need it. But you first have to go talk to somebody and deal with it on your own. If you just avoid the problem, that's missing something. And if you go try and make someone else fix it, then you're not living up to your potential. So for what it's worth, I feel like I'm becoming less eloquent because I've talked too long now, but hopefully that point makes sense. And here's the structural way in which that gets kind of worked out in the process. One other thing I'll say about that, the reason it can't be anonymous is they can't take a statement from somebody that's not willing to give one. And they can't ask you to defend your position or your client or some other client if you don't give names, that kind of stuff. It's a little bit weird because if you have a client who just says, I just slept with my therapist and they're so-and-so across town, if you don't leave a name, they can't know who your client is. And that's a confidential situation anyway. So oftentimes it's us trying to work with our clients to build up the courage to come out with their name and to be public-ish about that. And so it's just really tricky situations, but be bold. That's the takeaway here. I'm going to skip over the last point too. Some tips here on how to avoid problems. You can avoid complications, but you can't avoid everything. You're always going to have issues that are uncomfortable and problematic. But the better you get at just being effective, being de-escalatory, I don't think that's a word, like de-escalating situations, or building relationship after repairing relationship, I should say, the better you get at those kind of things, the less this stuff becomes a problem. And then I thought, just to finish it off here, I love this meme. If you're as reactive as your clients, it's not therapy, it's peer support. I think there's something to be said about that too. And if anybody gets the reference of who that guy is, tell me sometime later in class or in the comments below or whatever, because I think it's really funny. A funny meme. But anyway, all right. Well, thank you guys for sticking it out with me. I know it's been kind of long and I've been kind of blubbery more than usual, but appreciate your time and attention. And I will see you again in class. Bye-bye.